Hello and welcome to the Success Showcase. I'm your host, Eric Lopkin from the Modern Observer Group. And with me, as always, is Chip Janiszewski from the Happiness and Success GPS. Chip, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Eric. How about you?
I'm just glad we're still here. It's been one hell of a week. There's an old Chinese curse, may you interesting times. And this week certainly lived up to that. Here in the Northeast, we had, tropical storm / Hurricane Henri. Tennessee got flooded. We've got soldiers in Afghanistan trying to evacuate. It really is amazing what's going on around the world.
Yeah, it absolutely is. So hopefully everything gets under control. I mean, we definitely dodged a bullet up here yesterday because they were predicting a lot of damage and power outages and so on and so forth here in New England. And because it came to shore of the tropical storm and shot straight north over land, the winds died down and there wasn't, a ton of rain. And so a lot of the damage was kept at a minimum. Still praying for everybody who's out there affected by this thing. And obviously all the people who are working to bring things back together again. They don't get enough credit, but they deserve a whole lot.
Yeah, our thoughts and prayers go out to anybody who was affected by any of the natural disasters that hit over the last few days. And of course, our thoughts are always with our veterans that have served in Afghanistan and they're seeing what went on over there. So we're going to switch this around and bring in our special guest. We have Dr. Helen Flavin, and Dr. Flavin is a scientist and researcher, and we're going to be talking about STEM education and how we can do this. So, Dr. Flavin, welcome.
Thank you very much, Eric and Chip.
Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Okay, I'm a research scientist and an educator. So my research has been in understanding how the brain works, how the cells of the brain communicate with one another. My postdoctoral work was at Yale Medical School, and my teaching work has been at the college level as well as the high school level, and I've done some work at the middle school level covering grades 6 through 8, as well as been a science and math advisor for kindergarten through grade 8 for an elementary school. So I've got a wide variety of expertise and experience with STEM education, and I will say that for much of my teaching career, I have held positions both at the college level simultaneously with teaching full-time at the high school level. My college education, the courses that I chose were evening school courses, both in lab and lecture. The population of students that I was serving were adults who either hadn't had a chance to go to school earlier and they were coming back to college, or things didn't work out earlier for whatever reason for them and they were making a commitment and coming back to school. And I devoted my educational career to assisting each and every one of them to achieve their goals.
Fantastic. So, yeah, we've seen in the school systems just a failure to deliver STEM education. And for our listeners who maybe haven't heard that term before, it's science, technology, engineering, and math is what STEM stands for. And, we really do need this education front and center because every industry at this point is reliant on technology. It's no longer a separate sector. So tell us a little bit about your experience, maybe what's gone wrong with STEM education and how we can get it back into the schools.
Well, I'll tell you, my experience is a little bit unique because I came in as a college professor, and when I first came into high school, I came in with an open mind, and I was bringing a lot of the stuff that I was doing at the college level and trying to figure out how to adapt it and bring those challenging ideas to the high school students and see what they could or couldn't do. So I came in with a very open mind, and I also came in from a background where I wasn't trained, particularly as an educator. I was trained as a scientist. But part of your training as a scientist is to communicate effectively with other scientists and the general world population, as well as to be an educator at the professor level. So I had training to be an educator, but I didn't train specifically to be a secondary educator. And so when I came in as a secondary educator, I tried to pick up the buzzwords for education and how they were describing things and what they were doing and stuff. And one of the things I was noticing, like right at the beginning, people were like, I don't know if that's going to work. But then it worked. And then I would say, look at my students, look at what my students were able to do. And these would be students where other teachers had given up on them. And all of a sudden, the student science class is actually looking something up, being able to explain it, taking a look at something, putting the math together, and enjoying it. And then a number of teachers said, well, that's just kind of you. And it's not just really kind of me. It's what we ask of our students to do and the tools we put within their hands. And there's so many of these things that are out there. And I don't really know why there's a hesitation in the United States market to be able to use some of these tools. There are so many free tools out there. A teacher can select these, and a teacher can have students step into class, and the students are a scientist discovering. So there's a genetics lab out there. Students can step into this remote environment, so they're on their device, and they go to the stock room and they buy fruit flies in the stock room, and then they make the fruit flies. And then the students pretend to anesthetize the flies, and then they take a look. So in the stock room, they can pick any fly. The color of the body is different, the shape of the wings is different, anything. They make the flies, and then they take a look at the offspring. And then they take a look at, do the offspring match mom or dad? And they're being the scientist, just like the first geneticist to discover the material. Powerful tools like that.
Yeah, I was intrigued going through your website to learn more about you, and I love your STEM professional development. Really, your philosophies. I mean, we're talking about getting people interested in this, but you talk about transforming the middle school or high school science classroom to a place of high-end adventure.
Yes.
Virtually using what's available there, and your passion turning the complex into compelling. But it sounds like your approach has a lot to do with it, and I'm sure that's what you're looking to instill in other people, so they can get people interested. Because obviously the students, you have to capture their attention, especially the younger they are, and so on and so forth. But to turn it into something that they say, I want a piece of that. How do I learn more? It looks like that's what you're doing. That's exactly what I got out of just taking a look at that. I'm saying, wow, what approach.
That is definitely what's needed. And I'll share with you how I sort of discovered that approach. That's something that I learned from my students. Very first year I was teaching in high school. I was that college professor who had the notes ready, so the format at the time for teaching was you have an exciting challenge story you present at the beginning, you present all the scientific material, and then you pull it together at the end. So I always had this intriguing thing at the start. And so I took one of the ones from college and I took it to my anatomy class. And it happened to be the idea of many years ago for the neurons in the brain. Did they touch one another? Were they like wires touching one another, spliced together? Is that how the body works? Or were there chemicals? But we didn't have any microscopes that would let us look, so we had to think of an experiment. And I described a dream that a man actually had, the researcher actually had. He woke up, he wrote down his dream. Later on, when he got up out of bed, he went to the lab and he did his dream. And all I said to the students was, and in his dream, he thought about two frogs and their hearts. And what might we be able to do to see if it's a chemical or not? And I paused and I was opening my mouth to then begin to go into the science and talk about the anatomy and everything that we knew. And this student suddenly said, I gotcha. And I looked over, and this was a student who was, I'm going to be honest with you, a D student. He didn't like to read. He didn't like to study. And I saw the A students in anatomy class kind of turn around and look at him and go, oh my. And I said, okay. And the next words out of his mouth, he actually described for me the Nobel Prize winning experiment that this researcher had designed. And I stood there stunned, right? And I put down my notes thinking, I don't need these anymore. And it was almost an anticlimax. I taught class and everything. The other thing I remember, when the students went outside of class, his locker was outside my classroom. I could hear him telling his friends that he just discovered a Nobel Prize experiment in anatomy class. And I could hear the pride in his voice. And his friends were like, no, you didn't. No, you didn't. I stepped out in the hall and I said, yes, he did. And they went, whoa. And then the bell rang and everybody went to class. And I thought about that and I said, this has a power. So when we're looking at analysis, students who, for whatever reason, either English language learners or they disconnected in some way with education, if you give the question to them that is something that intrigues them and they want to think about it, those same students are very analytical because that's the way they've always survived. They are very open to figuring it out. And when they go to figure out the challenge and think about it, then you can actually, as an educator, kind of say, hey, you want to figure this out? How about if you take a look at this? And you gently guide them to things that they can read, they can take a look at, they can internalize, they can make connections. You're being the coach or the mentor. They're very engaged, they're growing. Any gaps in study skills or knowledge, they pick up really quickly because all of a sudden they want to solve the challenge. And when you think about the adult world of a scientist or the responsible adult world, even of an individual in society, choosing a medicine that would be good for my family member, etc., I want to be able to analyze. I want to be able to find out the truths that are known and then use my analysis to make a good decision. When we talk about STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, we're talking about preparing individuals for the life challenges that they're actually going to face. It's very important for each and every individual. It's also important for the United States as a country to stay on top of developments and making things better for all of mankind.
So, over the last year and a half, we've seen a lot of changes in education, switching to virtual models. And over the last, I'd say 2 or 3 months, there's been a big push to get students back into the classroom and stop using these virtual models. And they're saying, well, with the virtual model, our kids are falling behind. But from what you're describing, is it more of a case that our educational system has fallen behind how kids learn now?
I'm going to be honest with you. I think, without being judgmental in any way, I think our education system for how we prepare educators to work inside the classroom definitely needs to be tweaked. Essentially, educators themselves have to delve deeper into the science themselves so they can be better mentors, both at deciding units and things to use with their students and different activities and lessons, and also better mentors knowing where the students need to go. Anytime that you're an educator in a classroom, you are instantaneously watching all of your students, analyzing where each and every one of them is at in their understanding and knowledge. You're also analyzing where they need to go. And you're also analyzing, is an opportunity for me today that I can go over to student X and I can say, hey, you want to give this graphing a try? Or, hey, can you look at this figure for me? I can go over to a student who struggles with understanding figures. I can go and say, and if I can tell they're interested and they want to figure it out, I can show them something special and give them a hint and say, I'm coming back in 5 minutes. Let me hear what you have in mind about this. And I want you to be able to explain this to others. And I will walk away, and out of the corner of my eye, I can see that person taking a look at it, whispering to their teammates, figuring out, because they realize, maybe even for the first time, I can do this, and this is interesting. And getting it up to the higher level is actually very important, because what I found as an educator for years and years, I used to say to myself, because my two specialties, of course, with the PhD and stuff, when you're willing to teach high school, they're like, anybody who's gifted comes past your gateway in any way, before school, after school, in your class, whatever, etc. They all go through. But my other specialty was students people had given up on. And what the high school was amazed was my ability to reach them. And that's what I try to explain on my website, and I try to share with fellow educators. If you use, because so many people say, these kids can't take a look at that high level stuff because they haven't memorized the stuff they should have memorized in middle school or high school. Well, the answer is, in the world we live in, we don't have to memorize all the facts. What we have to do is become problem solvers, because we live in a world where you can call up any fact you need with the internet, any browser, Google, any other search engine you want to use. You can find facts. The part you really have to work on is being someone who puts the facts together, who analyzes things, who can express what they think that it all means and be able to share this with others. And all of that is supposed to be part of a complete science package. What happens though, in education, for some reason, there's a big education market. People brand their product and they call it CER, POGL, they call it problem-based learning, they call it backwards design. They come up with all these names that are brands, and they're using that for them to be able to come in and share their ideas and to sell a product to educators. And then you also have a new set of science standards. The United States adopted the next generation science standards, both at the middle school and high school level. And the idea behind that is three-dimensional science learning, where students are actually being a scientist, discovering, doing the science and engineering practices that scientists do, and understanding the connections between bodies of knowledge. And those connections that are emphasized in the next generation science standards, or NGSS for short, are called cross-cutting concepts. And so now the teachers are now faced with a situation where they're expected to teach with these new NGSS standards, three-dimensional learning. And when you go for professional development, you talk with a teacher, they're not even sure what that means. It was never part of how they were educated to become a teacher. So they actually have to begin to imagine what it's like to be a scientist before they can mentor a student to grow and develop as a scientist. So our education system needs somehow for future educators to be able to get them in-depth science knowledge, thinking like a scientist. Not just well prepared to teach in a classroom, but thinking like a scientist. Until we get there, what we really need is scientists to volunteer and partner in education, or even through professional development, scientists working with educators, getting the educators to imagine what deep learning looks like inside my classroom. If I can imagine what it's going to look like, I can imagine where my students are at, how to mentor them through some of the discussions and where I need them to get to. If I can't imagine what deep learning is going to look like inside my classroom, I can't bring my students to that level of learning. And with the beginning of school right now, there are some dialogues that are going on right now in like Facebook communities and stuff, educators talking to one another. There was one example that I just was part of the discussion the other day. Somebody was arguing about whether pH was a physical or a chemical change. And there was a good amount of dialogue on that. What it was a whole bunch of educators who were taught that students had to memorize an answer. It's either physical or it's chemical. They never actually even thought about, how do scientists use this tool? Scientists talk about physical and or chemical reactions. They're talking about the history of mankind before we knew what a chemical reaction was, before we could throw it into an instrument and say, this is the chemicals that are there. Scientists used their senses to figure out that if I saw any of these changes, if it's bubbling, if there's a temperature change, if there's a color change, if all of a sudden I see a brand new solid and it settles to the bottom, all of those things that I see with my senses tell me there's something new. That tells me it's something exciting to go explore. But the educators who were talking about this were thinking of it solely in terms of when you get to a state exam, and the state exam is going to ask on a multiple choice question, is this a physical or a chemical change? The student is supposed to be able to say physical or chemical. The educators stopped at a point way past how that tool is actually used by a scientist. Somehow, in order to improve STEM education in America, we have to get educators to the point of knowing and being able to use tools and think about them the same way a scientist thinks about them. One thing,
that's actually a problem that goes even beyond STEM education. I was involved with a program at Wesleyan University where they brought in experts to teach kids, and these were young children, from I think 5 to about 12 or so. And we were teaching them writing, art, music, all of these different subjects. but none of us were teachers. We were people that actually, I taught writing because I was a writer. We had musicians teaching music, and I overheard a conversation from the administration one day where they were going over their budget for the next year, and they were talking about, well, how much can they pay the teaching artists? And I actually heard one of them say, oh, we can't pay them that much because then we'll be paying them like they were real teachers. So the administration was putting more of an emphasis on being taught to teach rather than people that actually knew the subjects. And now we're seeing that in STEM as well.
Yes.
So before you go on, you mentioned a term a little while ago. I'd like you to explain the term deep learning. For those of us who haven't heard that, what does that mean?
Okay. I'm going to try to explain that in a way that doesn't involve any of the buzzwords or any of the branding words for education. When we think about deep learning, what we mean is internalizing the knowledge. I know it. I understand it to a deep level, meaning I can explain it to someone. I can explain to someone the how and why for how it's happening. And I can make predictions based on that understanding. And in order to achieve what I'm calling a deep level of understanding, I am taking the new material and I am making connections to what I already know about the world and what I've learned about life. I'm integrating or placing that new knowledge within that framework. And that new knowledge is getting me to think about things. And I say, ooh, I wonder if this might be related to, I wonder what would come next. Or if we're talking about something that's happening at a scale where I can't see the little molecules bumping into one another, let's say, I wonder what's happening inside that liquid. What's actually happening in there? And I begin to imagine what could be happening and what could cause it. And that wonder, that always having a new question and designing something to find the answer to the new question is who and what a scientist is each and every moment of his or her day. It's what we want to be encouraging from our students and allowing them to freely explore and build. And it's what we have to get into our education system. And so now, how do we get there? It's one of those things where I heard it expressed best by a vice principal for academic development at one of the schools where I worked. And he had taken a quote. It wasn't originally for education, but he twisted it a little bit for education. And he said, deep learning, good learning, it's hard to describe, but I know it when I see it. And that was what he used for a whole year for professional development for all of us educators under him. And what he meant by that was use any one of a number of tools, because hands-on, virtual science, student discussions, extra math, certainly literacy connections in science, graphing, understanding figures, they all have their place for science. And they are all skills that students have to do and incorporate and use as a scientist. And his idea of good education was he could peek into the room. He would see that the students were engaged. They were talking with one another about what they were doing. When he stepped inside my classroom, a student would say, hey, this is what we're doing. This is where we're at. Grab a piece of graph paper if you want to come join us. And he knew that whatever they were learning, whatever they were graphing, it meant something to them. It meant something deep to them, and that they were going to take it and walk out of the classroom and be able to use it in other life situations. And that's really what we want for all of our students in any education field. Challenge for the science of today, all of those wonderful education technology, internet things that can give us that answer in an instant. No more reference librarian and looking things up that way, like the old-fashioned way for those of us who are older. Those same things allow students to be able to make play little games with things, to memorize things, to make exciting little things that bounce and ping off one another and stuff that don't take them to deep levels, but they fill classroom time. And you end up with sharing educators sharing among one another quick and fun activities for students to do. Educators assume that students make the same connections. Like the educator will look at the activity and they will say, okay, if you shake up the marbles like this is a model for, and the educator makes a connection. But if he or she is not in the classroom, all the students are actually doing is shaking up the marbles. If the educator is not having the student explain what the marbles represent and predict and talk deeply about it, all the kids are doing is shaking up the marbles, and they're not making the connections the educator would hope. Best way to know what connections the students are making and what they understand is quite simply to dialogue with them and have them dialogue with one another. Instead of memorizing vocabulary words, have them use the vocabulary words as a scientist when they're taking a look at a virtual lab or they're modeling or they're explaining. They're using the words as a scientist. They can spell them as they're using them. They can practice that way. They're putting the words into a context, significance, a way of using them. They're making them their own. It's becoming part of their body of knowledge. That's really what we mean by deep knowledge, and that's what we really want to continue to encourage among all students learning science.
I was doing a little research. Again, I was intrigued by the next generation science standards. I mean, when we were young, science is the study of. And in business, Eric and I, we talk a lot about different things, and we analyze processes and structures and so on and so forth. And the 8 practices of the next generation science standards, which were set up, I think obviously it's appropriate for science, but for everything else that you're talking about, you talked about reaching the people who most people thought you couldn't engage. And with these 8 practices, I mean, step number 1 for anything is asking the questions, which is what you do. And then keeping the process going, developing and using models, planning and carrying out investigations, analyzing and interpreting data, using math and computational thinking, and then constructing an explanation for what you're doing. And this process can be used anywhere in education. And if we start explaining the educational system, this is how we're doing it, instead of study this book and take this test and hope you get a good grade to get into college. I think it makes a whole lot of sense. And I also think it's going to engage people a whole lot more, especially because step number 1 is asking the questions.
Yes, and actually, I think part of, and I don't have a simple answer for this one, but part of the way educators look at what students need to know, they love the idea of the practices. At the end of the year, the students take many states of the United States a mandated state exam on science, and the people who write the exams in multiple choice questions. They're easy to be computer, outside graded, etc., blah, blah, blah. So what you end up having is a system where a teacher has the fabulous NGSS in front of them, the next generation science standards. The teacher also knows the test at the end of the year is only going to test on facts, and they have to make sure each child in front of them in the room can know the facts and pick the right answer. The hardest thing to get teachers to appreciate until they try it for themselves, if you use the next generation science standard, science and engineering practices, and your students routinely think about things and explain things in depth within your classroom, yes, they may be explaining things higher even than the state testing at the end of the year is going to call upon them to actually be able to do that one day of the test. But you know what? 2 things about that. First of all, if they learn more than what's required, why is that ever a bad situation to know more than what's going to be tested? Second of all is, if they know all of that and they can do all of that, they're still going to pass and do well on the state test at the end of the year, because in order to be able to explain it and share it with others and be the scientist, or even in another discipline, be the person teaching and explaining it to the world, you have to have a deep knowledge of it. And that deep knowledge is going to guarantee that you pass that exam at the end of the year. So it's a win-win in order to be getting students to be able to do this. The other thing I will tell you, and this is not widely known about the next generation science standards, what they tried to pull back on was all the memorizing stuff. Because memorizing this, then memorizing this, then memorizing this, and having no framework to attach that to, doesn't allow students to develop the critical thinking skills. They can't use the knowledge in a way that they need to, because the person making the framework, making the decisions, and making the buckets to be memorized and doing all the metacognitive work is the teacher who set it up. So the students never learn how to do it. So Next Generation Science Standards said, we're going to go with, and the phrase is, less is more. So the teacher has a certain number of options they can look at. There's a few that is suggested as an example of how you can think about going really deep, making all the cross-cutting concept connections, using the science and engineering practices for this three-dimensional learning within your classroom. The same day the student is doing it, he or she's being a scientist, they're doing the practices, they're discovering the content, and they're making connections, maybe interdisciplinary connections or connections between what I'm doing today and what we did 2 weeks ago. Oh, this means this is connected to, and the answer is yes. And you know what? They just figured it out. I didn't tell them that that was that connection. They deduced or they found their own connection. That's the power of NGSS. And what else? NGSS frees up time for educators. It's designed as a system where you do what's asked of you. You have some discretionary time. In the discretionary time, you can figure out what is most interesting to your students in your classroom. You can design something that helps them delve deeply into something they're very interested in. So it gives them that moment of, hey, I can do this, I can succeed with this, and I think that this is fun. And when you get students learning at that level, they become self-motivated, independent learners. And that allows me as a teacher just to step back and just guide them where they want to go. And it's even more fun for me as a teacher because I get to share with somebody who really wants to know why and how some of these science things are so special.
That's fantastic. And we are just about out of time. So if one of our listeners wants to find out more about you and what you're doing, where can they find out?
One of the easiest ways would be to check out my website. And if you were to Google the phrase SciVenture, NGSS and beyond, you will find my website. Or it's also found at http://drhelenflavin.com. That will get you to my website. And there you will find a number of discussions on utilizing freely available virtual labs where students are the scientists discovering. And some of these are written at the high school level, and some of them are written for educators for middle school students. And some of them include presentations that I had given at the National Science Teachers Association STEM Forum. And so there's quite a variety of them. And my contact information is there. And I'm always willing to reach out and discuss things with educators and even help them design something for their students where they can design it, take a look at it, and then go to their administration and say, hey, let's give this a try. Our students can do this. Thank you, Eric and Chip.
That's great. So Chip, what do you think is the big takeaway for our listeners this week?
I love the process of starting with engagement. Once you get their interest, and I mean, you expect to be taught in school and maybe listen to a sermon in church, but otherwise approaching people and just preaching to them is not going to work. But if you get them engaged and interested and you have them asking you and picking your brains about your knowledge, and you have the process to walk them through it, asking questions and so on and so forth, to me, I mean, that's the key. It's got to come from them. And it's wonderful how you are doing this. I mean, as soon as I read what was going on, I'm saying, this is it. So I hope you teach a whole lot of teachers out there how to teach a lot better with the process. So thanks so much. It's been so nice to get to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think the big takeaway for me is the concept of deep learning and how we really do need to teach our students how to understand and figure these things out rather than these are the facts that are going to be on the test. So hopefully we can transform our education system so that more students are actually learning the details and getting engaged rather than just learning to pass a test.
Agreed. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Success Showcase. You can catch us every week at xvadio.com/podcasts. You can also find us on the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Audible, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts. Remember, make this your best week ever and make next week even better. We'll see you then.